Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's alumni webinar. My name is Rosella Garcia, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College. Before we begin today, I'd like to quickly remind you of some of my favorite ways that you can engage with TC. One, you can hire TC alumni and students. You can refer prospective students to the college. And we encourage you to show your TC pride by including Teachers College in all of your professional credentials and on your LinkedIn profile too. And we encourage you to share your own talent and expertise by volunteering to speak as a future presenter at a TC alumni event, or by joining one of the many alumni association committees and the volunteer opportunities that we offer there. When the time is right for you, I hope you'll also consider supporting TC financially by donating to the TC Fund. By sharing their time and expertise, our incredible alumni speakers make this webinar series possible, and we're so grateful to our esteemed alumni who are willing to share their knowledge with the greater TC community. Today, we have the pleasure of learning from Dr. Antija Allen, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Poughkeepsie State Community College, with nearly 2 decades of experience as an educator. Antija served as a Poughkeepsie Academic Center for Excellence faculty fellow for first-year experience, where she led faculty development around open educational resources. In 2021, Antija was selected by the Tennessee Board of Regents to be a Maxine Smith Leadership Fellow. Her cohort is developing a toolkit for Black male success in public higher education. Antija's recent publications include a chapter on academic freedom in classroom discussions, and of course, the upcoming book, We're Not Okay, Black Faculty Experiences and Higher Education Strategies. Today, she will lead us in examining book excerpts, and she will share strategies for inclusion and leave us with an understanding of the Black faculty experience, as well as strategies for fostering a more inclusive environment. Antija will be taking questions at the end of today's presentation, so please use the Q&A pane to ask your questions. She will also be asking for audience participation via the chat throughout today's presentation, and we encourage you to share your own thoughts and reflections. So without further ado, Dr. Antija Allen.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining me today as we discuss Black faculty experiences and strategies for inclusion. As was mentioned, this comes from a larger discussion of the book, We're Not Okay, Black Faculty Experiences and Higher Education Strategies. There was no possible way to discuss all the themes that are shared in this book, so I had to narrow it down and focus on just inclusion. However, other themes in the book include inclusion, retention, and promoting mental wellness. I am one of the co-editors along with Justin Stewart, and we have 19 contributing authors with this book, which is 13 chapters long. And we are being published by Cambridge University Press. Now, the big motivation for this book was really the statistics that exist around the number of Black faculty that are at our institutions, specifically full-time faculty. So this data shows that in fall 2018, 75% of full-time faculty were white, whereas 12% were Asian, 6% were Black or Hispanic, and then as you see, the numbers decline from there. So this was motivation enough to say there clearly is an issue that exists, and we need to find out how we can possibly provide solutions to any possible problems that may arise as a result of a Black faculty member being either the only one or one of very few BIPOC faculty at their institution. It's specifically predominantly white institutions. So for a good portion of the webinar today, we're actually going to read, and you'll have the opportunity to read along or listen to excerpts from the book. Now, these excerpts touch on different topics as well, but they all kind of have that common thread of inclusion. And so, as was pointed out earlier, I'm going to ask you to reflect and share in the chat your reflections after each excerpt. So here are some reflection questions just to kind of get us started. What stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Now, I will warn you that you might feel uncomfortable as you listen to some of these excerpts, but we always tend to grow from discomfort. More than anything, you're going to be able to become aware of situations that you may not have been aware of. If you are a Black faculty member, you might find yourself relating to some of these excerpts. And if you are a graduate student who intends on becoming a faculty member in the future, this might just be good information to have so that you know when you enter into academia what you may encounter. So let's start with our excerpt titled Malik. And again, feel free to read along or just listen. Malik looked disheveled and exhausted, far from what he was when he entered CCU and when Dr. Phipps first met him. His clean-cut face was now a pepper-grayed beard. His eyes gave the look of a lack of consistent sleep, and he was at least 25 pounds heavier. Something was clearly off with Dr. Williams. I just had a student the other day email me and say, Malik, I was just talking to Dr. Eden, Malik's white colleague in the department. Dr. Williams continued, I was immediately taken aback. What about Dr. Eden made him Dr. Eden? And what about me made it comfortable to be addressed as Malik? This comes from the chapter Surviving Higher Learning, Micro-Invalidations of Black Junior Faculty in Higher Education, authored by Dr. Robinson, Dr. Adams, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Williams. That is not a typo, there are two Dr. Williams. So looking at this excerpt, listening to this excerpt, let's go back to those reflection questions. What stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Feel free to share your responses in the chat. Now, as you're gathering your thoughts, one thing that I did want to add was the importance of representation. So when we see situations like this, where a Black male faculty member is not addressed as doctor, but addressed by their first name, some might say, well, that's because they haven't had any Black teachers in their experience, which is true for a lot of people. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at a college a few years back, and I asked the question, something that had something to do with, how many teachers they'd had that were people of color. And they looked at me and said, well, you're the first one. So in college, I was their first experience with a Black faculty member. So what I'm seeing in the chat is, I was struck by the description of Malik, a weariness I recognize in my own experience. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, you can tell that whatever he is going through at his institution is clearly taking a toll on him, and it's clearly taking a toll on him physically. And even through this very small quote that we're reading, you see that there's also something emotionally and psychologically happening as well. So going back to this idea of, inclusion, how could you feel comfortable or welcomed in a situation where you don't necessarily feel respected by your students because they won't call you by your title? So let's go on to the next one. Tokenism. Black faculty have also described institutional resistance and failure to increase the number of Black faculty on campuses as racism. This leads to marginalization, isolation, and feelings of not belonging within their departments or among colleagues. Black faculty are often the only people of color in their departments, colleges, and/or universities. Lack of representation has a direct impact on the experiences Black faculty encounter within the institution. Numerical underrepresentation leads to tokenism and being treated as though the individual epitomizes their entire race. And this comes from our chapter, Promoting Mental Wellness Among Black Faculty, Strategies for Coping, which is authored by Dr. Sparkman Key and Dr. Tarver. So again, going back to those same questions, let's reflect. What stood out to you here? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? And while you're doing that, I'm going to just talk a little bit more about tokenism. Many times we are in situations as BIPOC faculty where, again, we may be the only one. And so, you know, other than just feeling alone because you're the only one or isolated, there's many times where you may feel like you're being used to show diversity that may not really exist at an institution. For example, you may be placed on a search committee so that when a potential employee comes to interview, they see your face and they may think, oh, okay, there's Black people there, not realizing that you may be the only Black person there or the only Black faculty member there. So it's not a true effort of actual diversity. It's more of just a symbolic effort to say, hey, look, we have this person who's diverse here, but what are we really doing to actually bring in more people who are diverse and to make the people who are here feel comfortable at this institution. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next excerpt. This one is titled Help. Faculty often sought me out for advice for their Black and brown students, as I was the only Black female faculty member at Redtown. While I was open to talking with sincere peers, I was wary of random faculty members who only engaged with me when they had an issue with a non-white student. My apprehension was twofold. First, it was if they viewed themselves as the main character in the academia storyline. I only existed in the same space with them to aid in their success and not my own. Similar to that of the magical Negro movie trope found in such movies as Ghost, The Shawshank Redemption, and The Legend of Bagger Vance. And this comes from the chapter Testimonials of Exodus, Self-Emancipation in Higher Education Through the Power of Womanism, authored by Dr. Swindle and Dr. Roman. And so we have a comment in the chat, I believe going back to our previous excerpt. Unfortunately, this has not changed. I just completed research in 2020, 2021, where these findings still exist at PWIs. Absolutely, absolutely. I've found, even since we've completed the work on this book, I've seen so many more journal articles specifically that have come out that focus on these very topics, which just lets us know that there's still so much work to be done. This is still clearly an issue that we have in academia that we need to address. Thank you for sharing that. Now with this excerpt, feel free to say, you know, what stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Now, one thing that I always think about when I read this passage, and actually when I read this chapter, is the idea of being used instead of being utilized. And so I think many times colleagues may believe that they are utilizing their Black colleagues, their Black faculty colleagues, but really they're using them. You know, so if we don't have a discussion outside of you trying to tell me, oh, hey, there's this Black or brown student who needs your help, but do you talk to me about possible research collaboration? You know, do we exchange any information regarding, you know, maybe new teaching and learning styles? Or is it only I come to you when I need you to help me with this Black and brown student? Which I believe it's not that a faculty member is saying I don't want to help them. It's just, you know, this can't possibly be the only relationship that we have as colleagues. Okay, so in the chat, we are seeing a few comments. The faculty member is only seen as someone to solve problems related to issues of race and not seen for their full humanity. Exactly, exactly. We don't know, you know, is this person in chemistry, or are they in psychology, or, you know, I'm sure they have expertise in other areas. Why is it that it's only focused on the fact that, oh, you are, in this case, a Black female faculty member, I'm sure you're very motherly. So why don't you help it to nurture these Black and brown students? Okay, another one in the chat. Being the authority for any and all issues related to people of color, assuming people of color are monoliths. Exactly. Not all the same. Just because just because I'm Black and the student is Black does not mean that the student can relate to me or that I can relate to them. There's just this assumption there. Okay, let's see. Faculty of color appear to be the resident translators. I like that. I like that resident translators to help with Black and brown students instead of fostering a relationship with those students. Exactly. And so sometimes when I've been approached in the past with this type of situation, I actually start to ask questions. Oh, we're gonna have, you know, Sue come in and meet with you. Okay, is Sue wanting to change to psychology? Is she wanting to change her major? You know, so I start asking questions like, so in other words, what made you feel that this particular student was a good match for me to build a relationship with? Because it has to be more than the fact that we're the same race. And then another comment we have, it makes me wonder if they hired for that purpose primarily and secondly as an expert. That's a good point. That's a good point. Did they hire this person so that this can be almost like the point person for all Black and brown students that are at institutions? And something that I didn't mention is, and you may have noticed this as well in your own experiences, our student body tends to be more diverse than our faculty. So there may be a lot more students that need assistance than we have the faculty to aid them, right? Which means now you've created a situation where this person has their own other responsibilities, you know, of teaching and possibly research and other service to the college. And now you add on that advising or mentoring students, and now you see someone who's overwhelmed. Okay, so something else in the chat. Also to address the historical culture of the university and how that impacts, changes, barriers to hiring a diverse faculty. The getting beyond the only one in the room to address feelings of belonging. Absolutely. I mean, that's really what we need to see happen. We need to get to a point where we can have more diversity. Also, with the rise of DEI interest, Black faculty are being hired and then released if they don't represent the Black life stereotype that the institution was seeking to elevate. Good point. Good point. You know, you may go into an institution, and as we know, I mean, if you're a faculty member, you go in there with expertise related to a subject matter, right? And so maybe you want to focus on research about that subject matter, but not about race. Maybe you don't want to be on every DEI committee that exists. You know, maybe you don't want to be the one who takes on every initiative that deals with race. And if that's the case, then at that point, it's like, oh, you're not actually doing what we hired you to do. So I can totally understand that as well. Thank you. Thank you for all the comments on this one. All right, we're gonna move on to the next one. Scary Black man. Trying not to be viewed as the scary Black man takes a toll mentally and physically. This may be because I am a 6 foot tall, brown skinned man. Mentally, I prepare myself to not live up to any stereotype that is affiliated with being a Black man. Physically, I make sure to walk with an open body posture that seems inviting. I walk at a pace that seems like I am not rushed or hurried. I make eye contact and smile with every person I encounter to ensure the other person knows that I am not threatening. At the end of each day, my face hurts from all the smiling. In addition, I can relax and be my true self who experiences both positive and negative emotions. And this comes from the chapter Classroom Dynamics, Uncovering Hidden Truths While Black, authored by Dr. Marsh. Yes, I'm sorry, I saw this in the chat just now. It says the cultural tax is real. Absolutely, it definitely is. It definitely is. So tell me with this excerpt, what stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Now, as you're putting your comments in the chat, one thing that is shared throughout the book is this idea of code switching. And I think more people see code switching as, switching between two languages, or just kind of switching the way you speak from one situation to the next. So if I'm speaking to my mother, I might not speak to my mother the same way I speak to my friends, right? Or maybe I shouldn't, I don't know. So it can be that, but it also can be switching how I dress in a situation. It could be switching how I behave in a situation, because I've found that if I don't, then I won't be accepted in that situation. It can even be changing hairstyles, right? I remember years ago, I would not do a job interview if I didn't straighten my hair. And then I'm like, why am I doing this? And so then it went on for quite a while, but then I kind of got to a point where I'm like, well, if my hair is not straight that day, some days my hair is not going to be straight at work. So they need to just deal with it. It's not like my hair doesn't look bad. It's just not going to be straightened. So then kind of ask yourself, why are you doing that? Why are you straightening your hair for a job interview, right? Okay, so let's see some things that came up in the chat. It sounds as he is the one who needs to change, taking all the responsibility about how others feel, which is very unfair. Exactly, like instead of me, and this happens a lot, this happens very often, where we may feel like we need to do something to make others, usually our white colleagues, to make them feel more comfortable. Whereas why do we need to change ourselves to make others feel more comfortable? Do others do the same for us? Not usually. And then something else in the chat is saying, as if he doesn't have the right to have a bad day. Exactly. It's like you're not allowed to be upset. You're not allowed to be angry. And then if you are angry, you know, what's wrong with you? Like, now I feel threatened because you seem like you're very angry today. As if we all don't have a range of emotions that we experience on a daily basis. Yes. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move on to the next excerpt. Competence. One Black male professor reflected on his experiences of racism. African-American professors are confronted with institutional racism on a daily basis. Some of my students have challenged my credentials in and outside of the classroom. Black and brown professors often must contend with the assumption of some that their appointments and placements in academia resulted from affirmative action bids rather than their true intelligence and merit. This air of suspicion around their employment can undermine any sense of belonging and inclusion professors of color hope to experience on their campuses. And this comes from our chapter, Preserving Mental Health of Black and Brown Professors in Academia, authored by Dr. Mozak. I don't know if anybody's had this experience at all, as a faculty member, as a staff member, as a student, but it can't, I know for me, and I shouldn't be, I feel like every time I'm in that situation, I'm always shocked. I think it was maybe 2 semesters ago, at the very first start of class, and this was on a Zoom class, I had a student ask me, where did I get my degree? I was like, well, that's a odd question to ask. Of course, I was happy to say Columbia Teachers College, right? But still, it's like, why do you often question your professors where they got their degrees from, where they earned their degrees? Probably not. What about me made you want to ask where was my degree from? All right, so going back to the chat, with this one, what stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Okay. Oh. Okay, we have one comment. Once working for a private institution, some students asked where I studied to make sure I was prepared. So very similar to what you shared. Yeah, it's very interesting. Just that thought of seeing someone who looks like you, you can't possibly be educated, you can't possibly be intelligent, you can't possibly have the qualifications for this position. Okay, we have another one in chat. The air of suspicion. Was I hired for merit or to check a diversity box? And then sometimes if you go through it enough, and that's where kind of you start to think about that, that psychological toll that it takes on you, right? Like if you think about it enough and you're in enough situations like this, you may actually start to question yourself. Am I smart enough to be here? Do I really have the qualifications to be here? Right? Like, and clearly you do, but sometimes when all you encounter are these people questioning that, you may start to actually question yourself. Okay, we have some more things that came up in the chat. The unchecked implicit biases that I couldn't be qualified enough to hold the position. Implicit bias. Okay, here we go. I am Caucasian. However, oh, sorry. That's the thing about the chat. It starts to move. Okay, I am Caucasian. However, I have in fact witnessed some of these situations play out and really negatively affect some of my African-American colleagues and friends. I feel so badly that they have to deal with this bias and mistreatment. Yet many of my Caucasian colleagues dismiss my concern as foolishness. This in turn makes me feel extremely depressed. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's sad to see, it's sad to witness, and it's terrible to experience as the person who's experiencing it. And I think I'm glad that you were able to at least recognize that something is going on. We have many situations where our colleagues don't even know what's happening, don't even recognize the issues that are happening around them or what their Black faculty colleagues may be going through. Oh, wow. So in the chat, we have someone says they are the person, so someone is asking for an expert when I am in the room. So in other words, as if you're not the expert, they want to hear from the actual expert. Thank you for sharing that. The questioning of competence causes Black professors and professionals to fall into imposter syndrome. Exactly. That's what I was getting at with that last statement, which then makes the workplace or any environment tense, ultimately meaning that Black professors and or professionals can't make a mistake or must always over-prepare for the smallest of tasks or interactions. Exact. So then it becomes the pressure to be perfect, which no one is perfect, right? And so again, like what type of toll does that put on someone to constantly be doing things to make others feel comfortable, to not seem like to always seem like you are, to make sure people know that you are the expert and that you never make any mistakes. Like that is a lot of stress to put, for others to put on you, and then for you to start to put on yourselves. And this is the last excerpt. I'm upset that it's the last one. Some really good information in the chat. All right, so this last one is George Floyd. And I think many people probably noticed that this became, I want to say, the situation or the incident that sparked a lot of change in a lot of institutions. But in some situations, nothing really changed at all, but at least we know for sure that before this particular point, there was a lot that was happening in our institutions that people weren't recognizing, and they weren't, if they did recognize them, they weren't in a position to try to change anything. And I think after this situation or this incident, we saw a lot more people calling for change. So on the day that George Floyd died, May 25th, 2020, the combined weight of living in the space of this oppression and still continuing to produce scholarship that gave voice to this work became too heavy for me to bear. I became vocally paralyzed. I tried in vain to say or write something, anything, but the words would not come. Within my institutional context, things continued as usual. The phones did not stop ringing, and email messages continued unabated. One of my colleagues called me the day after his death without a preamble to discuss administrative matters that needed to be addressed. And all I wanted to do was scream at her. Yes, it all needed to be addressed, but for my Black body, the life energy was draining out from me. I found myself clutching my own bruised and bloodied heart, grasping for breath, and I needed space to adjust and recalibrate, to rest a while. And this comes from the chapter, Bearing a Black Woman's Burden, Provoking Perspective Taking for Action in Predominantly White Academic Spaces, authored by Dr. Hernandez. So this is, again, our last excerpt. What stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? And as I said at the beginning, there may be some people who can relate to much of what has been shared with these excerpts, and may also relate to this excerpt especially. So what stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? Okay, so we have something in the chat. I have a friend who is a retired National Hockey League player. He tends to lean pretty right and was a huge Trump proponent. That being said, I will never forget his Facebook post on the day that Mr. Floyd was murdered by those police officers. He said in much stronger language, had I been there, I would not have cared if I risked getting shot. I would have jumped in and pulled that moronic cop off of Mr. Floyd. Thank you for sharing that. The next comment, wait, sorry. Here we go. Every time I have the chance to read about experiences like this, I can feel the pain and frustration and ask myself why we cannot pause for a moment and reflect on this horrible situation to process it. Yeah, why do we have to keep going? Why can't we give ourselves a minute to feel it, experience it, you know, as you said, process it? And the last comment I see here, the need to self-care, mindfulness, and create spaces for it for our colleagues. The assaults continue daily. Yes. Okay, more. I recall breaking down and bawling my eyes out on the privacy of my office. I was drained of being exposed to constant Black death. It's painful, and sometimes you don't know what to do. Yep. Thank you. It makes me think of the slap in the face 2-year sentence that the other Minneapolis police officer got for the murder of Daunte Wright. Yeah. And we're still seeing, I mean, it's after George Floyd, mentioning Daunte Wright, clearly, this was not the last incident like this. This was not the last murder. We've since had more that have had a large impact on many of us emotionally. So thank you. Okay, we have another one. Oh, sorry, it's coming up pretty quick. I recall how my white colleague could only identify with the officer and couldn't or wouldn't address the racial injustice of a man losing his life. Additionally, having to remain silent and professional about it all. And that can be very difficult. I think just as this excerpt pointed out, there are people who, many of us had to return to work. And you do hear people discuss situations like this very openly and very honestly. And you may disagree with what they're saying, but it's like, do I have the comfort level to say something? And if I say something, how can that affect me professionally if I actually share what I really feel and show up kind of as my authentic self in this situation, in this conversation? Okay. Next comment, people need to see us, know we are more than our role in research or academia. Take a minute to understand that my intellectualism does not separate me from my body. My mind is attached to my Black body. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And honestly, that's really kind of where the name of this book came in. We're not okay. Because I think there's this idea that because we are continuing to teach, because we are continuing to do our research, because we're meeting the needs of our students, because we may show up smiling, right? Oh, they must be fine. But really, there is a huge segment of us who are really not okay, but we are still getting things done, but it doesn't mean that we're okay. We're absolutely not. Okay, so a comment that's directed at you, Stephanie, is in the chat. It says, those white colleagues of yours must be void of any hint of emotional intelligence. Yeah, the need for emotional intelligence is major. We're definitely seeing in these types of situations. It's even if you should be able to have some sort of empathy, even if the person isn't the same race as you, doesn't mean that you can't relate to what they are going through. All right, so these were the questions that we originally started with. What stood out to you? How did it make you feel? And how do you think this impacts inclusion? And I want to thank everyone who's been sharing their comments in the chat. And so a question that's been added here is, what action should be taken on the institutional or individual level to address these issues? And so I'll look at a few more comments while we're answering that last question. Okay, when they see us in 7 seconds on Netflix portray the systemic and institutional racism inherent in our society. Yes. And we need institutions to be more, now see this is good because it actually answers this last question. And we need institutions to be more compassionate and divest from the habits of white supremacy. Yes. So what else needs to be done on that institutional or individual level? I hope I'm not saying this incorrectly. Tima Okun's work on the habits of white supremacy is critical reading for leaders of organizations or institutions who want to lead otherwise. Thank you so much for that suggestion. Okay. I need institutions to create emotionally safe spaces with professionals to address the trauma of working in white spaces. Yes. That is exactly why we wanted to make sure that this book had something that addressed mental health and mental wellness. And not just because I teach psychology, but because, clearly we are affected psychologically. So, and some of the strategies that we provide in those chapters have to do with what the institution can do, but we also have some strategies in place for faculty themselves. All right, I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So I'm going to continue to share in the chat. Please definitely continue to share in the chat. I just want to just provide some strategies that we have from the book. Please keep in mind, this is like the shortest list of strategies. There are so many strategies in every single chapter. That was something that it had to happen. We could not have a book that only focused on experiences, which is great because I do believe there's a need to raise awareness, but I have a bigger desire for change, as many of the authors of this book also have. We want to see actual action taking place. We don't want to just constantly be sitting around sharing our experiences without anything actually happening after. So here are some strategies. Share these experiences and affirm them in order to recognize that what BIPOC faculty and staff are saying is true and real. And for me, when I see this strategy, I see this as a start, right? So let's start with sharing our experiences and having them be affirmed. Have your institution say, yes, this is actually happening. This is really happening to you. You are not delusional, right? Okay, and now what's the next step after that? So I feel like this right here is a really good first step as far as a strategy. Mentoring Black faculty to assume existing and forthcoming leadership roles. And we need to see that in general. We need to see more leadership roles in academia beyond just the DEI roles, which are very important roles and vital roles. However, that goes back to what has been explained earlier in the chat. We're more than just, people who can talk about race. We have other expertise. We have other, things that we offer, right? And so that mentoring for Black faculty, it doesn't have to be internal. There could be some external mentoring as well that the institution makes sure that is available to you. Look at the concept of diversity and inclusion as vital assets to the organization's performance. People don't realize that when you have more diversity in your institution, it actually aids in so many other areas, especially not just when you talk about the performance of the organization, it also can be like the financial benefits that it actually has on that institution. And then this one, cross-cultural communication training, is just another one, learning how, just kind of, again, going back to some of the things that are written in the chat, how do we have these conversations across cultures? How do we discuss, whether it be these types of situations that we shared in this webinar, or it's just any type of, communication about any type of issue or situation? Like, how do we have those discussions? And I do want to say that none of these strategies stand on their own. So when you look at these types of things, you want to say, okay, I can combine these to have, you know, to really have a real inclusive environment, to foster an inclusive environment.
Thank you, Antija, for leading us in this discussion. And I do want to echo your thanks to those on the audience that have really been vulnerable and shared. And we encourage everyone to participate in a way that is comfortable for them. And we thank you all for being part of this discussion. As a reminder, you can add additional questions directly for Dr. Allen onto the Q&A pane, or if they happen to come into the chat window, we can see them there too. So wherever is easier for you, please do go ahead and share those questions. And I want to just, thank you for sharing the excerpts that you did choose, and ask you, do you think those, the passages that you've chosen to share are pretty reflective of the overall content of the book? Do you feel like there were some that really you wish you could have also included, just so that we could spark some additional themes or conversations that were central to the book?
Yeah, it was very difficult to narrow it down because we have 13 chapters. There's also an intro that I authored called Breaking Our Silence, and it's also a conclusion that's very powerful. So it was very difficult to narrow it down to just this handful of excerpts. But overall, I would say this does kind of give you a feeling of what the book is about. There is one chapter that we end with called Programs with Promise, where we actually highlight programs that are at actual institutions that have been pretty successful when it's come to either diversity, equity, inclusion, or promoting mental wellness for diverse faculty.
That's great. Hopefully those become pilots for all higher ed campuses soon. Our question from the audience: what do you think non-BIPOC people can do to change the culture and effectively support our BIPOC colleagues?
You said the question was for the audience or from the audience?
From the audience. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think kind of going back to that one excerpt where I felt like it really expressed what happens to so many, especially Black female faculty, but Black faculty in general, this idea of being used rather than utilized. So, think I'm your colleague, we're in the same discipline. Let's talk about how to collaborate on things within our discipline. You know what I mean? Like, don't treat me just based on the fact that I'm here to bring expertise as a Black person. Utilize my expertise in other areas as you would with any other colleague. Also, getting to know your colleagues. You can't assume what your colleague may need from you, because everyone is going to be different, and their needs are going to be different.
Exactly, which segues perfectly to our next question, which asks, as you mentioned before, Black people are not a monolith. Mm-hmm. What is an insight or theme that struck you in compiling this book that uncovered a nuanced or intersectional dynamic about the Black faculty experience and perhaps might need further research?
There's a lot of discussion around intersectionality in the book, mainly, and it's probably just because of the composition of authors, but mainly intersectionality between like being Black and being a woman, right? But I think that I would have liked to have had more information on being Black, being a woman, man, non-binary, and also being disabled, or and that we do have some information about intersectionality of being Black, being male, and identifying as queer. So there's some there, but I would have liked to have seen more of that as well. So I feel like those are two areas that I think more research needs to come out around. Because even when we were kind of digging and trying to find things to include, there wasn't a lot out there.
Definitely more to come. And I'm curious, if you could go back in time, you've spent 20 years plus probably in the higher ed, if I'm remembering
yes.
Correctly, in higher ed. So what would you tell a young, Antija, as she's starting this higher education career? And, what advice, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to yourself about how to enter this field and industry as a young Black professional?
I think one of the key things that I wish I had done a lot earlier in my career was show up as my authentic self a lot sooner, right? I feel like I'm definitely showing up as my authentic self now, but I wish I had done that a lot sooner. And I think my experiences in a lot of situations would have been very different. Yeah, I think that's the biggest part, the biggest advice.
I mean, I think that's so important. And just a reminder, feel free to keep sharing your questions in the chat. But I think, you know, one of the passages that really struck me was, or the excerpts that you shared, was sort of the scary Black man, right? Like trying to put on this persona. And, you know, we sometimes feel the need to perform, if you will, to meet others' expectations. And that's certainly, it's hard, you know, not to be your authentic self. And then you're sort of doubly exhausted at the end of the day, right? So that's certainly something that I think is great advice to young professionals. And, you know, what advice specifically about joining the academy, right? Joining as a faculty member to really earn the respect, and I guess I shouldn't even say earn the respect, right? Like to have that respect commanded and to be on the same level playing field. Is there any specific advice for those seeking faculty positions that you might sort of share for those ready to get launched into their career in the academy?
Interview your institution. Interview your institution. I think many times we are so interested in getting into academia, being a faculty member, that will pretty much go anywhere that that says yes, right? Because we just want to get that experience, but you don't want to end up in a negative situation. So I would definitely say take the time to interview your institution, find out if they have any policies around DEI, find out, you know, what, maybe if you can, find out what the experiences of other BIPOC faculty have been at that institution. You know, when they ask you if you have any questions for them in those interviews, these are the types of questions you want to ask. Ask them if there's opportunities for advancement for BIPOC faculty, you know, any opportunities for mentoring. Like those are the types of questions you want to make sure that you ask. Don't just jump on that first opportunity, which can be very difficult because we all want to get that experience.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, you touched on this a little bit before, and I know it was thematic in some of the reflections that folks were sharing, but, you know, the title is We're Not Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, an absolute truth that people have carried forward. And yet Black colleagues are still showing up every day doing the work, and you know, in some cases maybe struggling, or in some cases may just feel this burden of having to perform, to do the extra bit there. So what can we do to check in on our Black colleagues, to check in? How can we help?
I think for one, you know, sometimes when you have these types of presentations, right, you tend to kind of have the same 4 or 5 people that show up for the presentation. So you end up kind of like preaching to the choir. I would say that when you see opportunities like this, take advantage of opportunities like this to be engaged in these types of discussions. You know, maybe take on committee work that maybe you wouldn't normally take on. There was a suggestion for some reading. You know, take advantage of all. There's so much literature out there that can be helpful to you and beneficial to you as a colleague. There's a wealth of opportunities out there I would say to be a better colleague.
That's great. And I hope that maybe you and your colleagues that have published this book will also think about, you know, perhaps you said some of the institutions that are already doing this work, perhaps that could be, you know, studied, what has been successful, and sharing that out so that other institutions could follow suit, sort of like a guidebook. I think that would be amazing to help us all come along and create more truly inclusive experiences that really see us all as individuals and understand what our Black colleagues and faculty are going through, and understanding, how we can really celebrate all members of our community.
Yes.
Well, without any other questions in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and start to transition to our closing. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Antija Allen, for sharing your great work, for being with us here today. We do look forward to hearing what comes next from you. And to those of you who joined today, thank you so much for being such authentic and vulnerable participants in this process. And I think that is truly how we will continue to forward our dialogue and progress. And so look out, we will be sharing a recording of this. We'll also be sharing some more ways for you to stay in contact with Dr. Allen if you'd like to hear more about the work that she's doing. And we encourage you to get in touch and let us know if you have other ideas for future presentations. Certainly, we want to keep dialogues such as this moving forward and as part of our community as well. I also encourage those of you who are interested in seeking out a community of Black professionals as well to look to our TC band group, which is one of our affinity groups for the Black Alumni Network Development. And you can find us on LinkedIn. We'll share that information in our follow-up email as well. And we look forward to continuing to bring you all together in community and to continue to learn. So thank you all very, very much. Dr. Allen, thank you. And please stay tuned for our next webinar, which will feature Dr. Warner Burke and David Hoff on learning agility. Thank you all for being with us today.